Hi, and welcome to Natasha Explains It All. Today's episode is part three of the How Criminal Courts Work series. Before I get into today's topic, just want to let listeners know that I welcome feedback as well as reviews, which help more people discover the podcast. And I also want to know what you think about what I've been sharing. And I hope that it's resonating. And if you have additional questions or suggestions about future topics. So, with that, I want to pick up where we left off at the end of part two. I talked about that for this episode. I want to talk about pretrial release programs. And, so we've talked about arrest and then being incarcerated and then having to pay bail in most cases in order to buy your freedom and how bail bonds work. And for those people who are able to get out pre-trial, meaning before their case has resolved. This often involves being subject to a lot of restrictions. And oftentimes those are tied to a lot of money. These are a lot of the cases that I work on. And so, what do I mean by that? So, even if you've paid bail, which again, they claim falsely that you need to pay money in order to, make it more likely that you'll show up for court and like will protect the community, even though both of those are false narratives. It's often not enough. Even if you've posted bail, you will often also be subject to various conditions while you're out. And they might be tied to what your charges are. Like if you're charged with the DUI, you might have like alcohol monitoring conditions. But it doesn't have to be. Like judges make stuff up all the time and there's very little due process involved. They will just put whatever conditions they want, and then whatever the pretrial supervision agency is, which sometimes is a government office, sometimes it's the probation department that will also be in charge of pretrial supervision, and sometimes it's contracted out to a private entity. And those agents and those officers sometimes have discretion to add on their own conditions as well, which can create a serious conflict of interest if they're making money off of the same conditions that they're allowed to have discretion over. And what I mean is, for example, a very common pretrial supervision condition is drug testing. And in many places, you have to pay for your drug tests. And the prices range. It totally depends on where you are. Most of the time, your ability to pay is not considered. And drug testing can be anywhere from $10 to $50 to actually 60 um, dollars per drug test. And then there's additional fees if like the test comes back positive and you want to contest it by having it sent to a lab for like a deeper, screening. And so, um, I was mentioning the conflict of interest. The conflict of interest comes in where they're charging you this money for this drug test, but then they also get to decide how often you drug test or how long you drug test, but they are making money off of each test. And so the incentive is not actually to protect public safety. The incentive is to generate profit for them. And a common thing that happens as well, which helps reinforce this point that it's actually not about public safety, is that if you don't have the money to pay for the test, uh, in some places they won't test you. You just don't get tested. And then they'll file some type of violation report with the court, and you can end up back in jail. So not sure how that promotes public safety. If drug testing is so important, why would they deny it just on the basis of someone not having the money? Anyway, let me back up a little bit. So you've posted your bail and the court, and so you are allowed to be released, but the court has put a bunch of conditions on you being out. So it's not just having posted your bail, you also have to do a bunch of things. And these conditions often include a curfew, they can include a geographic radius, they can include having to report to some type of pretrial supervision officer for either weekly or bi weekly or monthly check ins. It can involve drug testing, as I mentioned, breathalyzers. It can involve electronic monitoring, which means having an ankle monitor on your ankle that you have to charge. I'll get into that in a second. It can include, if it's any type of um, domestic violence charge or battery type, there can often be a stay away order as well. Or it doesn't even have to be that. Like, even if it's like a shoplifting charge, there could be a stay away order from whatever the alleged store was. Um, and there will also be all these other ones that are very cookie cutter, but also are random. Like, you must be employed, and you must obey all the laws and rules of the jurisdiction, even though you have to do that anyway. Oftentimes, this will include, um, the conditions will also include like prohibiting you from partaking in any type of alcohol or drugs, even including marijuana, which is legal in many places. But even in places where it is legal, even recreationally, that might be a condition of your pretrial release that you are not allowed to consume what are otherwise legal products, as well as alcohol is legal for adults to consume, but you might not be allowed to as part of your conditions. And and if you violate any of these conditions, you can go back to jail. And this is something that I don't think that is well known by people who don't have firsthand experience of this. As I was mentioning in prior episodes, many people are sitting in jail simply because they can't afford bail. Among those that are able to get out, um, even among those people, they oftentimes will end up going back to jail because there's so many restrictions on their freedom. And if they violate any of those conditions, they go back to jail. So it's not because there is, it doesn't even have to be that they, were arrested for new charges. It can simply be that they violated one or more of these conditions. And those conditions are incredibly burdensome, oftentimes have nothing to do with what the charges are, and very often punish people for simply not having enough money. And I want to explain more about how that works. So, let me talk a little bit first about the ankle monitor stuff. These ankle monitors, first of all, are designed to just be humiliating because, as we know, with Fitbits and smartwatches and all that kind of stuff, the technology exists that you could have a very discreet tracking device that does all the functionality of a ankle monitor, in terms of tracking your location and beeping if you go outside of, the geographic area that you're permitted to be in. But it's designed to be bulky and uncomfortable, as a form of humiliation. Um, and these devices have to be charged, often for hours every day. And you have to like sit there with your ankle against the wall in the outlet, charging it. And you often have to have a phone line dedicated to that, um, which most people do not. And so you might have to have like um might have to buy a phone plan or like get the installation to be able to even have that monitor function in your house. And if the battery goes low, or if you go out of your zone, it can beep, and beep loudly, which can be incredibly humiliating and embarrassing if you're like at the grocery store or at work. Um, and it's designed to be this way. Or, your pretrial officer can just have it set off. I remember talking to a witness who, had a particularly bad experience with a pretrial program, and the pretrial officers would like deliberately set it off while he was in class. And he knows that they knew he was in class because he had to provide his schedule, of where he was going to be when. And so um, the 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 idea that is sold to the public about this particular condition is that it's a safe and easy and effective way to be able to monitor people and make sure that they're compliant with their stay away orders and things like that. But in reality, it is designed to humiliate people. And like I said, the technology exists for it to be a much more discreet thing to still accomplish the same function, but that's not what is used. There are these really bulky ankle monitors that cause a lot of physical pain and are incredibly sensitive as well. So people who have to use them, and again, this is all pre-trial, just reminding you that there's been no conviction. You haven't been sentenced, you haven't taken a plea, you haven't been convicted, and this may be one of your various conditions that you have to be subject to. And if you don't follow them perfectly, you can be sent back to jail. There's so many ways that you can be sent back to jail for things that are other than actual criminal activity. And so these devices are also extremely sensitive. So, like, you can't submerge them. So, you can't take baths. You have to be extremely careful in the shower. You can't use any type of like alcohol product with them. So, like, you would have to be careful of even like what kind of soap you use. Because if any type of like residue gets on them, that can cause problems. And then the device can go off and it can register that you've violated it or tampered with the device, even though you haven't. And oftentimes, if you if they consider that you've damaged the equipment or tampered with it, that in itself can be a new criminal offense because it's considered destruction of property or like tampering with evidence and like all kinds of like BS charges related to this device. And um, it's an example of how once I hope this is a theme that will come out throughout the course of this series. Once you're in the criminal system, the system makes it very difficult for you to get out because the conditions that are imposed are incredibly burdensome and designed for people to fail. And I'm just giving a little bit of information of how this ankle monitor works as one example of that. And there are so many. And the other is money, because it's all about making money, which is another big theme that I keep bringing up. And in many, many places, you have to pay for these devices. You have to pay for these conditions. And if you can't, you go back to jail. And a lot of people can't afford them. They can be extremely expensive. Like for these ankle monitors, it's very common to be like around $300 to $400 a month, which for a lot of people is an unaffordable amount of money. And sending people back to jail simply because they can't afford this does not serve any type of higher good. It is a way to make money off of the backs of the poorest people. Another condition that's very common as I was saying, is drug testing. And man, like the practices around drug testing are so shady, because oftentimes these pretrial officers are not actually trained in how to read drug tests. People are often charged much more for the drug test than it actually costs to administer the test. If you have a false positive, too bad. Oftentimes, you will have to go to jail in the meantime while the test is being retested, uh, and you'll have to pay for it to be retested at a lab. And in many places, like they still test for marijuana, as I was saying. I mean, oh man, the conditions that I have come across uh, are varied, and can be extremely absurd. So, for example, one example is a alcohol monitoring breathalyzer program that requires people to go in person every day, twice a day, 7 days a week. Oh, and by the way, you can only go during certain periods of certain times. It's between 8 and 10 in the morning, or it might be 6 to 8 in the morning. There's like a 2 hour window in the morning and a 2 hour in the evening between 5 and 7. So you tell me how someone is supposed to be able to have any semblance of a normal life, be able to work or go to school or raise their children, and have to come in person twice a day, every day, 7 days a week to do a breathalyzer test and pay for it, by the way. And if you can't come up with the money, they'll refuse to breathalyze you, and then you'll be violated and reported to the court, which means you can go back to jail because you're not complying with your conditions. And, I think a big part of like the mythology of this system is that this is supporting public safety, but destabilizing people's lives with these conditions that are so burdensome and so overwhelming has 100% the opposite effect. And oftentimes in the pretrial context, there's actually no actual like support systems. It's just testing and very punitive measures. There's no support programs. There's no classes. There's no counseling, um, social services. Things that people might need. And it's just really more punitive. Again, even though you haven't been found guilty of anything, and you're charged along the way for all of these things. I have seen dollar amounts anywhere from $120 a month to $800 a month, depending on what kind of program you're in fees. People can't afford this, and so they often go back to jail because they can't keep up with the fees, which completely defeats the purpose, right? Because now they're sitting in jail, now they have no money, and it's going to be even harder for them to get back on their feet once they get out. And in the meantime, if they're going back to jail, it means now it's even harder for them to prepare for a defense of their case. They've got childcare issues, they may lose their housing. They're just being more and more destabilized. So, backing up again, if you're able to get out of jail pre-trial while your case is still pending, you will often be subject to a variety of conditions. There will be limits on your freedom and a variety of conditions that you will have to comply with. And if you don't comply with them, you can go back to jail. And they are conditions that are not criminal for an average person to do, right? An average person doesn't have to check in with an officer and drug test and charge an ankle monitor and have a curfew. And yet, if you violate any of these things, or like paying fees, you can go back to jail. Um, and and so it creates this very perverse incentive for pretrial offices, particularly the private ones, to put people on as many conditions as possible and to try to get as much money out of people as possible, rather than any type of actual concern for public safety. And the presumption of innocence that is, supposedly so integral to the American criminal system totally goes out the window when you have these pretrial conditions. Because, as I said, your freedom is conditioned on complying with these things. And if you don't, you can get in serious trouble and it can also affect your sentence. And so I don't want to make it sound like there's no circumstances under which some pretrial conditions may be appropriate. The reality is that these conditions are overused, incredibly burdensome, and very, very often um, are financial, that you have to pay money to continue to be free. So you not only had to pay bail to get out of jail, but then in addition, you have to continue to pay money to stay out of jail. And that's wrong. Freedom shouldn't be conditioned on your ability to pay. And it contributes again to two systems of justice of those who are able to pay versus those who are not able to pay. And even for people who have more means, it can cause them to have to make some serious adjustments to their lives. I remember talking to a witness once about, was on one of these pretrial programs, and he had a good job, but because of the cost of pretrial services, he ended up he couldn't afford his apartment anymore, and so he and his son moved in with a friend of his. Even though he had a good job, but he just couldn't keep up. He couldn't keep up with the expenses, and so had to give up their own housing. And we're lucky to be able to move in with a friend. But I mean, what a destabilizing factor for that person and for his son, for his family. And um, you know, uh and if you again, if you don't show up to one of these check-ins with this pretrial officer, you can go back to jail for that. I mean, can you imagine missing a meeting and going back to jail over that? I had a client recently who the pretrial officer alleged that he had missed a few check-ins, even though she was forced to admit that he actually had either been late or he had called and left messages and she had spoken to him. So he had made efforts to be in contact, even if he had missed the actual appointment time. So he had made efforts to be in touch with her. And then the court decided to drug test him right then and there in court. And unfortunately, it came back positive. So he went back to jail for that, for missing slash not missing some check-ins with a pretrial officer, and then having a positive drug test, and then was in jail for over 30 days because the judge raised his bail amount and he had to come up with the money, and it took him that long to be able to beg and borrow from other people to be able to post his bail. In my opinion, that's not a just system, and I'm not sure what that is promoting. I'm going to do some different episodes, or a separate series or thoughts about how the court system treats drugs just in general, and how that is the number one area that feeds criminal courts, and why I think that's incredibly wrong, because drug use in particular is one of those very stratified areas. All social classes, all backgrounds of people use drugs, but but enforcement is definitely not even at all. Particularly wealthy people use drugs just as much or more as people with less means because they can afford more, and yet they're not punished for it, and it's glorified in TV and in the circles that they run in, and they're not punished for the very same behavior that someone with less means or a person of color will be punished for. And anyway, so before I get too much off on that, drug testing is extremely common condition, and you often have to pay for it as well. And if you can't pay for it, you're going back to jail. And that is a problem because it is another aspect of the system that conditions your freedom on your ability to pay. Again, so like I said, it's another moneymaker for this system. So you haven't been convicted of anything, but they can easily take thousands and thousands of dollars from you in these pretrial fees. Which, by the way, if your charges end up being dismissed or you are acquitted and found not guilty, you don't get the money back. You don't get any type of refund. They keep that money. And if you are convicted, you don't get any credit either. Like that money is not then applied to, which will be for a different episode, any court costs, any court fines, any probation related fees. Because, oh, yes, financial penalties are a very, very common part of sentences for a variety of sentences, misdemeanor, felony, of any, category of charges. So, um, yeah, I'm realizing this is complicated, and I'm going to do my best to try to break it down more. But I think I'll kind of pause for there and pick up and try to explain more about this pretrial supervision context. But punchline, even if you can come up with the money to, hire a bail bond company to post your bail and you get out, oftentimes you will still then be subject to a variety of conditions on your freedom, including financial conditions that you must comply with to stay out of jail. And in a later episode, I'm going to talk about the plea bargaining process. And the reality is that a lot of people end up taking a plea simply to get off of these conditions because these conditions are so burdensome that people just can't deal. Another scenario that's come up a lot that I've seen, it's like that let's say you have to do breathalyzer, like a remote breathalyzer. You have a device that you have to blow into at certain times a day, every day. And if you miss one of those blows, then your pretrial officer will require you to drop everything and to come in person to drug test with them. People have jobs. People have childcare responsibilities. I've talked to people who have lost their jobs over this because the pretrial officer is saying, you need to come in now. You need to come in now to drug test. And the person's at work, and if they leave work, they're going to lose their job or miss out on a day's pay. And that's just not sustainable for them. But this happens over and over again. But the person's like balancing, well, do I want to go to jail or do I want to lose my job? Well, most people would prefer to avoid jail, so they go, but now they've lost their job. And a lot of drug testing is random. So you call in every day, often between 5 and 7 days a week. You call in to see if you have to drug test that day. And if you have to drug test that day, you have to show up. It doesn't matter what your plans are. It doesn't matter what your obligations are. You have to show up that day between whatever hours the office is open, or you're going back to jail. Pretrial supervision is designed to be destabilizing, when what it should be, if there is any supervision, is to be helping people be more stable, right? And to be in a better position, because that will promote public safety, right? When people are able to have the support and structure that they need to be successful rather than setting them up for failure. Okay, that's enough. I'm going to stop here and we'll pick up next time with more on pretrial supervision before getting into plea bargaining. Thanks for listening and see you next time.